The following finding was reported to the British Board of Trade in April 1876. Quote, "The loss of the vessel was due to her having got ahead of her reckoning, owing to the disregard by the master of the force and direction of the tide. They think he ought, from the warning he received, to have known that his ship was out of her position, and, knowing this, it would have been his duty to have put her about and returned slowly to his course. For not doing so, the court think Captain Brickenstein was greatly to blame."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? A long, cold wait on the Deutschland.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Deutschland was an iron-hulled screw steamer of 2,898 tons. She was built for the Bremen-Norddeutscher Lloyd Line of Germany in 1866, specifically for their Bremen to New York route. She was made to carry both a large amount of passengers as part of the large emigration demands that existed at the time, as well as cargo. It was a role that she would stay in for almost a decade, until December of 1875, when she would meet with a misfortune that would make her a topic of international interest, as well as becoming the center of an international debate about where blame should lay for how her career had ended so tragically. The Deutschland had departed from Bremen at 2:30 p.m. on Saturday, December 4th, 1875, with a crew of 130 and an estimated 150 passengers. Though, as often the case at the time, children were not counted on the passenger lists, so it is hard to get an exact number. In addition to her passengers, the Deutschland was described as having been heavily laden with cargo. Though their voyage had just begun, they were almost immediately forced to anchor again due to how hazy it was once night fell. The next day they set sail again, and Sunday passed entirely uneventfully, though, as they neared the English Channel, they encountered stormy weather. As a precaution, Captain Brickenstein ordered that the ship should travel at half speed. The ship was now buffeted by strong winds and snow. The snow meant that it would later be admitted it had been difficult to see, and therefore they could not say that there had been a proper lookout. Captain Brickenstein would also say that he was not familiar with the occurrence in the area, and that the wind had been very strong. Without anyone realizing, the current and strong winds had brought the Deutschland far off course. The first hint that Captain Brickenstein had was that around 4 in the morning on Monday the 6th, he saw breakers ahead of the ship through the flurries of snow. Captain Brickenstein ordered the Deutschland's engines be reversed as soon as he saw the breakers, but the sudden reversal was too much for the ship that was already being strained by the storm. The propeller broke before the ship could even begin reversing, and with the wind directly at their back, the ship was carried directly onto the Kentish knock. In spite of the storm, the passengers had all been asleep at such an early hour, and they were woken up by 2 heavy bumps and shocks that rattled the entire ship. The passengers either got dressed quickly, or rushed to the deck still half-dressed to find out what had occurred, only to be handed lifebelts by the crew. The boats were cleared, but due to the rough weather, they were not launched yet. Captain Brickenstein ordered that rockets be fired, but due to the poor visibility, the people in the nearest town of Harwich would later report that they had seen nothing in the darkness. The knock lightship, which had seen them within 15 minutes and responded to their signal, but the sunk lightship, which was the next in the relay, did not seem to notice. Captain Brickenstein would have liked to fire cannons to alert the area of what had occurred, but with the waves that were now crashing over his ship, this proved impossible. Already some people on the Deutschland had been carried away by the heavy seas that swept over the ship. There was nothing anyone could do, though, other than wait until daylight and hope that someone could see them then. When dawn finally came, rather than wait for help, it was decided that at least some people should try to escape the Deutschland in the boats. 3 boats in total were launched, and all of them were almost immediately broken away from the ship and washed away out of sight of the people on the ship, who could only assume that they were lost. They could only continue to fire rockets in the hopes of gaining attention. They could see ships passing them in the distance. But in the daylight, and with the snowstorm still raging, it was even harder to make them see their rockets than before. At 9:30 a.m., the people on the sunk lightship did finally notice the rockets. And they did what they could to also bring attention to the plight of the Deutschland by firing guns and sounding their foghorn at half-hour intervals through the morning and afternoon. At 4:30 in the evening, with it getting darker, the lightship began to fire rockets to reassure the people who were on the Deutschland, and the Deutschland began to respond. These rockets would also be the first time that the Cork light vessel, the light vessel closest to Harwich, was alerted that there was a ship in distress, and the word was quickly passed to Harwich. The problem was that no one knew what sort of ship was in distress, where exactly it was, and how many people were on board. Worse yet, Harwich did not have a lifeboat to send out to aid anyone. There had never been considered a need for one, since the Kentish knock, which was the largest navigational hazard in the area, was 24 miles away. Too far away for the lifeboat service to think of it as a practical post. On board of the Deutschland, the ship was still severely bumping on the Kentish knock, but it had yet to break apart, as the people on board of her feared. She was now taking on water due to the strain, and the passengers were forced to work the pumps all day to try to keep the situation from getting worse. As darkness came, the storm got even worse, and the ship's creaking renewed everyone's fears that the ship would not last long. The passengers were told to rest in the cabin for the night, but it was later said almost no one actually slept. No one had any doubt about the danger they were all in. At 2 a.m, their fears were confirmed, when the call went out for everyone who could climb the ship's rigging to do so. The ship was filling with water faster than the pumps could keep up. Panic set in for many at this moment, and there were stories of people deciding to just give up then and there, rather than suffer for an extended period of time in the rigging with no hope in sight. It was said that one man had thrown a letter in a bottle overboard for the wife and child he had left in Germany, only to follow it moments afterward. Not everyone despaired, though, and many of the stronger and more athletic passengers and the sailors took it upon themselves to help the weaker people on board the ship up to safety. The case of a German passenger named Adolf Hermann was specially mentioned, since he had held a young American woman named Anna Petzold in one of his arms when clinging to the rigging with the other arm the night they spent in the rigging. When they had left Bremen, she had been put in his care by her brother-in-law, and Adolf Hermann was determined to keep his word and insisted that she stayed by his side no matter what. At one point, someone produced a bottle that was passed around for the comfort of all. At another point, a sailor who had clearly thought ahead produced a ham, some cheese, and a couple of loaves of bread and distributed among the survivors. The people who were left on the ship were forced to endure a freezing 6 hours in the rigging of the sinking Deutschland as the ship settled and filled with water. People sometimes succumbed to the cold, and others were swept away when the deck became covered with water and the waves reached the lower rigging. The people who had reached the higher rigging and were able to keep their holds without falling victim to the cold could do nothing but cling on and hope that a rescue was still on the way. When daylight once again broke, it came with the low tide as well as the wind becoming less dramatic. A portion of the aft deck of the Deutschland was once again safe to stand on, and those who were left climbed down and did their best to warm up by stomping their feet. They also did what they could to find food and water, but these were in short supply since the cabins were filled with water now. Even though they were now able to stand on the deck, there was still very little they could do but wait and hope. Help was in fact on its way. The problem was that the people in Harwich had not known about the presence of a wreck until the evening, and due to the poor weather, it would not be safe for them to venture forth. The ship at anchor at Harwich that would be best able to navigate the dangerous area of the sea and go to aid of any ship in such conditions was a commercial steam tug named the Liverpool, under the command of Captain Carrington. Captain Carrington was not willing to risk his men's lives or his tug on a dark and stormy night, among the many navigational hazards that were present in the area where they believed the shipwreck had occurred. Captain Carrington did order that steam be built up in his tug close to dawn, and a little before 6 in the morning, he headed out to see if he could find the ship that was in danger. The first place Captain Carrington went was the Cork lightship, and they told him that the sunk lightship had been firing all night. The Liverpool therefore went to the sunk lightship, who told him that there was a steamer on the Long Sand. The Liverpool therefore headed to Long Sand, only to find that there was no ship there, so he headed on towards Knock lightship. Halfway to the Knock lightship, Captain Carrington spotted the Deutschland on a sandbank, but wanting more information first, especially if there were still people on board of the stricken ship, he still headed to Knock lightship first. The position of the Deutschland was a dangerous one, and there would be no reason to risk his men if no one was left on the ship. The Knock lightship did not have any answers for him, however, and he could do nothing but anchor his vessel under the lee of the Deutschland and send his ship's boats to investigate. They found that there were still many people on board of her, and soon the Liverpool was anchored alongside the wrecked ship, taking off a total of 173 people. Out of the survivors, only 15 women and 6 children remained. Many of the women and children had remained in the cabin, which had filled with water and become inescapable. Among the people who had survived the night in the rigging was Captain Brickenstein, who reported that when he left his ship, the tide was rising again, and the ship was being battered worse than before. These people were landed in Harwich, and immediately placed under the care of North German Consul of Harwich, who ensured that everyone got the best care possible. The town also mobilized, and soon money was being raised, and donations of clothing and food were pouring in for the people who had suffered on the wrecked ship for 28 hours. The boats from the town also mobilized, as the weather became less severe, and soon remains were being brought back to town for proper interment. In cases where their identities were not known, pictures were taken of them first in the hopes of giving loved ones closure in the future. Items also began to be stripped from the wreck, which caused much more divided opinions. Some people pointed out that the men who made their living partially from stripping wrecks this way were also the first people who went out to aid wrecked ships, and that they often risked their lives to save people when possible. Other people, including the German government, voiced the opinion that anyone who made their living in this way was a wrecker and practically a vulture, stripping the belongings of those who had been lost. There was one more survivor, though, one that no one would have thought possible. When the boats had been swept away from the Deutschland, everyone had assumed all 3 of them had been immediately swamped. On Tuesday, December 7th, a lifeboat washed ashore in Sheerness, with 3 members of the Deutschland's crew in it. 2 of the people were lifeless, but 1 person remained, the quartermaster, Beck August. He had been in the boat for 38 hours. Quartermaster August was in such poor condition that everyone assumed that he would soon follow his companions, but he instead gathered his strength and told his story. It turned out that the lifeboat he had been in had indeed capsized. Indeed, it had capsized twice, but the 3 men had managed to right it and climb back in. The rope that had attached them to the Deutschland had snapped, however, and the men tried to row back to the ship, but were unable to in their weakened states. They had finally put up the boat's small sail and drifted before the wind with no idea where they would be taken. Both of his comrades had quickly succumbed to the bitter cold and wet, but Quartermaster August had held on. He had passed the Nor light, but they had not heard him shouting for help due to the high winds. When he had seen the lights of Sheerness, he had decided to deliberately ground his vessel rather than running the risk of being swept out to sea. The people in the town could not help but notice that while the 2 sailors had life belts on, Quartermaster August did not have one. When questioned, he said he had not even considered putting one on. His entire thought was to save the passengers, and he voiced a deep concern that he was the only person who had survived. The people of Sheerness quickly launched tugs to investigate, where Quartermaster August had told them the Deutschland had wrecked, and that was where they learned of what had occurred. The people who could be saved had already been saved by then, but at least Quartermaster August had the reassurance of not having been the only person to escape the wreck of the Deutschland. The investigation into the high cost of life in the wreck of the Deutschland was one that was fraught with politics. The German government and papers were quick to condemn the lack of a lifeboat in Harwich, and the fact that Liverpool had not ventured out as soon as it was learned that there was a wreck, but had instead waited until the next morning. Some people in the region were inclined to agree that there should be a lifeboat in Harwich, and a subscription was soon started to get one, but that did not stop their defense of Captain Carrington and the tug, the Liverpool. After all, the tug was a private vessel, not a government one. Captain Carrington had gone out with no chance of profit, and with great risk to save lives, and instead of being thanked, it seemed wrong to many that he was being accused of not doing enough. The official inquiry found that the Deutschland had not had the latest navigational tools, and voiced their belief that Captain Brickenstein should have been more aware of the danger his ship might be in due to the area he was in. They also included a recommendation that a better way of communicating between lightships be created. Everyone could agree that a relay of rockets as an alert had done very little to explain the actual situation in this case. At the insistence of the German government, it was included that a lifeboat should be present at Harwich, even though the Lifeboat Association protested that, due to the long distance from the Kentish knock, it would be very little use. No matter what the findings were, the high cost of life could not be ignored, nor could the severe frostbite and permanent injuries suffered by those that were brought to shore. The only person who voiced any happiness at the situation was Adolf Hermann, who stood at the train station on the Monday following the wreck. With him stood the woman of the town who had been organized by the wife of the mayor to present each of the female survivors with a bag of essentials and some money before putting them on the train to London. Among them was Anna Petzold, whom Adolf Hermann announced to the press he was now engaged to.
For more information, please see Great Shipwrecks, A Record of Perils and Disasters at Sea by William Henry Davenport Adams, published in 1877, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.